We've looked at how population changes over time and in relation to positive and preventative checks. Now let's look at where all these people live. When we talk about settlement, we use two terms, site and situation. Site refers to the specifics of a place, for example, the amenities connected to that place, like fresh water or adequate rainfall. Situation is the description of that site in relation to other things. As an example, when you're looking for a place to live, you're probably looking at both site and situation. Site factors would include number of bedrooms, the view, rent, parking spaces, etc. Situation refers to the relative location of that apartment. So I might find several apartments with relevant site characteristics, but situation will likely remove most of them from my list. There are three basic factors that determine where people live: climate, topography, and culture. We talked about the impacts of climate in an earlier video, and topography can impact how easy or difficult it is to settle an area. Culture can be a little harder to define, but we'll look at that in more detail next week. This broadly relates to the Greek view of ecumene and non-ecumene, based largely on latitude-longitude. But as we saw earlier, it's a little more complicated than that. Climate is a significant factor. As we saw with our look at biomes, it's hard to sustain life in freezing areas, and hard to grow food as well. Agriculture is very hard in humid areas due to nutrient leaching. There are more poisonous, venomous plants and animals in these regions. We can often overcome climate issues with technology like irrigation or air conditioning, but it increases the cost to live there. We'll look at a map in a moment, but most of the population lives in the northern hemisphere, and about 2/3 live in the mid-latitudes. Here you can see, to some extent, the impact of climate. Some of the concentration here is simply due to the fact that there is more land in the northern hemisphere, but notice how few people live above a certain latitude. Think back to our discussion on the Peters projection and whether or not maps project a northern-centric viewpoint. It's easy to see how that might happen, since most of the population lives there. Topography is also somewhat obvious. It's much easier to farm and build houses on level terrain. Deserts and bare, rocky soil don't support plant life well, so soil content is important and related to climate and topography. Living on the coast or along a river, especially in pre-industrial times, meant built-in transportation and a ready food source. And we know that mountains are not only challenging to build on, but also impact climate, and at extreme elevations impact the amount of oxygen available. Some places, like Nepal and countries along the Andes, have developed adaptations for elevation, but there's no denying that flat areas near sea level are just easier. Half the world's population lives below 200 feet, and most of us are below 1650. Think about driving through California and how many more settlements there are in the Central Valley than up here where it's hilly or in the Sierra. This map of population density illustrates some of the effect of topography. Notice people are concentrated near the coasts, away from dry regions, and mountainous areas like the Himalayas and even the Alps in Europe are pretty much empty. Settlement also occurs according to cultural elements. Cultures which have land traditions, such as holy sites and migration routes, will develop settlement patterns that correspond with those places. They may seek out areas with similar political systems or similar language. Or they might seek terrain that reminds them of home, either in terms of the actual landscape or in the crops that they can grow. We'll look at some maps of major cultural components in the next unit. Wherever humans go, they leave their mark on the planet. We'll talk about this more when we discuss sustainability, but we can see it everywhere we go. The link here for 12 Huia birds was not working when I last checked it, but you can find it in the App Store for your mobile device. It's based on the book of the same name, which illustrates the human impacts on their habitat that drove them to extinction. The picture on the right of the Amazon basin shows rural population pressure, which has led to extensive deforestation. In the upper right corner, you can see the smoke where they're burning out the trees to clear more land. Not only do we create settlements, but we move from place to place. Migration patterns often reflect world events, war, plagues, political change. These are usually push factors, things that push you to leave a place. Pull factors are things which pull you to a new place, such as school or a new job or some local amenity. Sometimes migration can be driven by a combination of these. Push factors might not be quite enough to get you to pack your bags, but when combined with pull factors, you decide to migrate. Immigration is the term used for people who have come into a country and settled there. Emigrants are people who have left a country, and that term usually sticks until they've formally immigrated somewhere, although they may also be called refugees if they're fleeing a bad situation and have no fixed destination. Immigration is often ruled by nations, and in some areas, emigration is also controlled. We'll look mainly at recent migration, but recall from our section on landforms that the shape of the land has not always been the same. Prehistoric migration was enabled by lower sea levels, land bridges, between England and Europe, and the US and Russia, as well as other places. More recent migration patterns are driven by exploration, colonization, and later decolonization. Here's another cartogram, this time on net immigration, which is the total number of people coming in minus those leaving. Recall from our population pyramids that birth rates in the US and Europe are declining, but both areas have enough immigration that their populations are still increasing. Here, let's look at some major migration flows from the 20th century, beginning at the end of World War I, with significant numbers of Eastern Europeans migrating to the US and Canada. Some of these are quite obvious, driven by war or genocide, while others may be more subtle. Some of these are the result of decolonization, as with number 9. Many islands in the West Indies gained independence during this time, and some, nervous about what that might mean for them, chose to head back to the seat of the empire, Britain. The Turkish migration to Germany in 1945 was the result of the Germans inviting guest workers to help them rebuild their country after the war, since many people of working age were killed or injured in the war. Immigration from Mexico and Central America has risen steadily since about 1950 due to a series of U.S. policies regarding Latin America that either made immigration easier or made emigration necessary due to escalation of violence as a result of American interventions. The key distinction between migration and refugee status is that migration has an implied permanence, while refugees are theoretically planning to return home. Sometimes, however, that's not actually possible. Huge numbers of refugees have been forced out of their homes and have been unable to return for decades. The link to this map is in the description. Take some time to visit it. This map is mesmerizing. There are some populations that have migrated in such numbers that we look at them as a diaspora, a dispersion of a particular group. This particular dispersion is largely a result of the Armenian Genocide of 1915, when Armenians were systematically wiped out by the Ottoman Turks. Many Greeks fled Europe after each of the world wars, and many more were forced out after the Greek Civil War in the 1960s. Greeks in particular are considered chain migrants because they often follow friends and family and form diaspora communities in their new country. Most major cities in the eastern U.S. have at least one Greek Orthodox church, which typically operates a Greek school to help preserve their culture. The term chain migration is often used disparagingly these days to plant the idea that if you let person A in, they will import their entire family, and that's a bad thing. But realistically, if you had to flee your country, wouldn't you want to go where you had friends or family? So chain migration really just means that migrants tend to head to places where other people from their cultural group have already settled. And yes, it might be family members, and yes, they might be helping you move, but it's not the gateway to mass immigration that is sometimes touted in the media. The Jews were perhaps the first group to be labeled a diaspora, as they were repeatedly expelled from their settlements. Expulsion and ostracism pushed them all over Europe, and eventually concentrated them in and around Poland, as Poland was one of the few countries most willing to accept them. As anti-Semitism grew to a fever pitch, many fled to the U.S., and of course during the Holocaust, many went wherever they could to escape persecution. Following the creation of Israel in 1948, the diaspora became concentrated there, as many continued to flee Europe and were joined by others from around the world who wanted to establish the Jewish state. As long as there is inequality in the regions of the world, there will be migration. People may flee persecution or famine, or just be seeking a better life. These flows show only major migrant flows, but notice which countries are largely immigrants and which are largely immigrants. Teaching migration can be tricky, as it can trigger a host of emotions and prejudices children may not be aware of. Younger children can think about why they might prefer to sit in a particular part of the classroom, while older children will have studied some of the historic events that caused some of these major flows, and can reflect on what they might do if faced with such circumstances. Migration can be a great place to unpack ideas about belonging to a community or about welcoming refugees who can never go home again by personalizing and humanizing migrants. In the discussion this week, you'll reflect on who is a refugee, and the other activities are a combination of population issues and migration questions with some great questions for the classroom.